Dear ladies and gentlemen, experts and guests, I'm pleased to greet you. I'm Irina Lopatyuk, and I'm going to be your moderator today. So mentality as a scholarly subject intersects a massive range of disciplines, studies related to business, management, communication, marketing, as well as intercultural studies, philosophy, psychology, history, geography, myth and folklore studies, anthropology, criminology, and studies concerning the fate. Therefore, this conference brings together scientists, experts, researchers, and journalists from different fields of science and practice who have studied mentality, its role, manifestation, and influence on various aspects of our lives. I'm sincerely honored and pleased to welcome everyone to the online panel of the international conference arranged by the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. The key discussion points of the current online session are as follows. The first question, mentality and fate, how are they related and why? And the second question, face at the direction of one's aspirations. And now, please, let me introduce our speakers right in the way they're given the floor. Dr. Oleg Maltsev, Ukraine, is the world's renowned European scholar, head of Mira Institute named after Grigory Popov, the author of exceptional scholarly works in criminology, psychology, and philosophy. He is a presidium member and academician of the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Dr. Maltsev is the head of the Expeditionary Corps, the prime department of the Mira Institute, which has been conducting field research worldwide for more than 8 years to explore how different nations and rulers attained power throughout history. We are glad to have you today with us. The next speaker and expert is Dr. Michael Conforti, USA, a Jungian analyst, founder, director of the Azizi Institute, and teaches at the New York and Boston Jung Institutes, a pioneer in the field of metapsyche studies, and represents his work internationally, including Latin America, Italy, Russia, and South Africa. He is the author of Threshold Experiences, the Archetype of Beginnings, and Field, Form, and Fate, Patterns in Mind, Nature, and Psyche, translated into Italian, Russian, and Spanish. He was selected by the Club of Budapest and the University of Potsdam to be part of 20-member international team of physicists, biologists, and dynamical system theorists to examine the role and influence of informational fields. We are pleased to welcome you, dear Dr. Conforti. The next speaker and dear guest, Kэрol Shumeyt from USA, Ph.D. Comparative Literature, University of Colorado. She has taught the course on psychological type at Pacifica Graduate Institute since 2013, when she co-taught it with analyst John Beebe. Her book, Projection and Personality Development via the 8-Function Model, synthesizes decades of research on the unconscious functions of Jungian typology. She launched the journal Personality Type in Depth in 2010, and in 2020 helped launch the Depth Typology Center, created to archive scholarly resources at the interface of depth psychology and psychological type. My share greetings to you, Kэрol Shumeyt. The next speaker is Doctor of Philosophy, Alexandr Sagaidak, head of Theron Association. He's a psychologist, Jungian analyst, hypnologist, academician, expert in anthropology and sociology, the chairman of the Psychological Philosophical Scientific Society at the UAS. Right now, let me please deliver a few words about the reference terms of this panel. So each speaker has the opportunity to answer 2 questions in 2 rounds. And please limit the extent of your speeches up to 8 or 10 minutes, no longer, please. And to begin with, we shall start the discussion on the first issue, mentality and fate. How are they related and why? And by this moment, I'm glad to give the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Oleg Maltsev. You're welcome.
Я рад вас всех приветствовать, уважаемые дамы и господа.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to greet everybody on this panel.
Наконец-то мы в своей тарелке.
Lastly, we are feeling just like at home because of the subject of today's talk.
3 индианца, 1 представитель школы Сонди, как бы на одной панели. Как бы.
What has happened that in one panel we have 3 Jungian scholars and 1 follower of Leopold Sondi's school.
Да, наконец-то никто не будет мешать.
And lastly, nobody is going to interfere and bother us.
Да, и мы можем заняться наконец-то делом.
And we are going to get to the business altogether.
Так. Когда мы говорим с вами о связи менталитета и судьбы, я хотел бы вам напомнить как бы работу самого Леопольда Сонди.
And speaking about the relation and interrelationship of mentality and fate, I would like to start my speech with the works of Leopold Sondy.
И следующую минуту, которую я буду говорить, она, наверное, не для участников панели, а для тех, кто нас смотрит в настоящий момент времени, чтобы они поняли, о чем пойдет речь.
And the next minute of my speech probably would not relate that much to the participants of the panel, but to our viewers, just so they understand what am I going to talk about.
И вы помните, да, что когда строится какая-то дисциплина, то сначала возникает философская категория, да, потом возникает уже категория как бы отрасли науки.
So as you know, when we have the formation a certain discipline, first as the foundation of it, we end up having a certain philosophical category. And after that, everything stems to form a specific area.
Вот. И когда Леопольд Сонди подходил к изучению судьбы, он как бы вот этой психологической категории как бы судьбы вывел так называемую как бы побуждение.
And when Leopold Sondy was studying fate itself, speaking about the psychological category that he was using, he came up with a category such as drives.
Да, и, в общем-то, если мы с вами сейчас бы рассмотрели менталитет как категорию науки,
and if we are looking into the mentality as the scientific category,
вероятнее всего, это была бы категория социологии или, я бы так сказал, на стыке психологии и социологии.
Most probably it would relate to sociology, or it would relate to sociology and psychology at the intersection.
Потому что очень многие люди пытались не академическим способом изучать судьбу.
There were a lot of predecessors and people that were attempting to study the subject of fate in a non-academic manner.
И по сути своей, когда мы с вами как бы говорим о изучении судьбы в академической науке, если мы не касаемся философского поля,
and if we're speaking about studying fate in academic science, not touching the philosophical field,
нам необходимо выбирать категорию как бы отраслевую в науке, которая будет тождественна как бы судьбе для того, чтобы проводить исследования.
We will have to choose a certain discipline in science that would be identifying with a fate in order to conduct the research.
Я не знаю, почему до сих пор ни одна отрасль науки не выбрала менталитет в качестве базовой категории исследовательской судьбы.
I don't know why there's no discipline. Nobody chose a specific discipline up until this day in order to study mentality as the foundation of fate.
Но как бы мы могли бы как бы точно сказать, что, возможно, наша конференция, наша беседа станет толчком для кого-то, кто станет считать ключевой исследовательской категорией науки менталитет, исследуя судьбу.
However, I hope that this conference and this discussion that we are going to have today might give some impulse or an inspiration to some other scholars to start considering mentality as a key element of studying fate.
То есть Сонди считал, что побуждение порождает выбор человека.
Leopold Sondy believed that drives or motives a person to do something, they define the choices in his life.
А сумма выборов человека творит его судьбу.
And that the sum of all choices that one makes in his life creates his fate.
Если же мы возьмем менталитет, это как бы выбор без выбора.
And if we talk about the mentality, then it is when a person is set in the situation when he has choice without a choice.
И, в общем-то, когда мы говорим о выборе без выбора, мы говорим о том, что выбор бы мог быть сделан, да, то есть как бы, но его почему-то никто не делает.
And so this situation when person has a choice of no choice, probably a person could have been able to make a specific choice, but for some reason people do not.
И это психологическая сторона менталитета.
And it is a psychological side of the mentality.
Если же мы будем говорить о социологической стороне менталитета,
and if we are speaking about sociological side of the mentality,
то здесь ключевой проблемой будет, как бы, скорее всего, безопасность.
the key problem in such a case would be security.
То есть люди привыкли жить в неких сообществах.
People are used to living in certain communities,
И им кажется пребывание в сообществе наиболее безопасной категорией, как бы, их жизнедеятельности.
and they naturally think that being a part of the community or a group would provide a safe life for them.
Безусловно, все эти категории, как бы, требуют серьезного, как бы, исследования.
And needless to say, all these categories that I have mentioned, they require an in-depth study.
Но на то мы и находимся, как бы, на конференции, чтобы рассуждать и дискутировать на эту тему.
And this is one of the reasons we are in the conference to discuss and look into these matters.
С моей точки зрения, связь менталитета и судьбы, она не просто очевидна, она фатальна для человека.
And in my personal opinion, the interrelationship between mentality and fate is not only obvious, but it's fatal for a person.
То есть если судьбу, как бы, человека представить как рельсы,
If we imagine, hypothetically, the fate of a human being as the path that the train goes on,
то по сути своей менталитет это и есть эти рельсы.
then we could imagine that mentality are those railroad ways.
То есть это по сути рельсы, по которым идет поезд судьбы человека.
In other words, the railroad where the train of fate of a human being passes.
И поэтому так сложно работать с этой категорией, потому что поезд, он не самолет, и не вертолет, и, как бы, не космический корабль.
And this is one of the reasons why it's not easy to study fate and mentality, because when we speak about the train, it is not an airplane, it's not other type of vehicle.
Да, нельзя взять поезд и переставить с одних рельсов и на другие, на ходу.
I mean, we cannot just take the train on the go and try to shift it to another railroad. It's just not possible.
То есть сначала поезд надо остановить.
First, we have to stop the train.
А человеку любая остановка кажется подобной смерти.
And for a human being, any stopping feels like it's death. He doesn't want to do that.
Да, и поэтому, как бы, он все делает для того, чтобы этот поезд не останавливался.
And human being does everything in order not to make this train stop.
И это та бессознательная сторона менталитета, о которой мы здесь, как бы, говорим.
And that is that unconscious part of the mentality that we are discussing here.
То есть человек, по сути, без внешнего вмешательства, чтобы изменил менталитет, он должен обладать сатанинским усердием и просто божественной волей.
So human beings, they do not want to change their mentality. So in order to have a person who can change his own mentality without an external influence, Dr. Matsev says that probably such a person should have a godly will and satanic determination.
То есть я не видел людей, которые могут без внешнего вмешательства изменить менталитет свой.
I have never seen even one single case when it would have been possible to change the mentality of a person without an external influence.
Но в конечном итоге менталитет определяет нашу судьбу сегодня.
But at the end of the day, it is mentality which defines our future.
Если мы представим, что это метро многоэтажное,
and if we imagine that it is, let's say, a underground way, the metro, which has several layers,
и там везде проложены рельсы,
and on each floor there are certain railroads,
то менталитет определяет не только по каким рельсам человек будет ехать, то есть само направление судьбы.
Then mentality would not only define the trajectory of one's fate,
но оно определяет и на какие уровни он может подниматься по этим рельсам, а на какие не может.
But the mentality would also define to what kind of levels of his own fate he is able to go up or go down? What are the railroads that he can travel?
А это прямо прямое влияние на социальный статус и карьерный рост в обществе.
And that in turn directly influences the social status, the social standing that a person has, and his certain career path in this life.
В свое время один из выдающихся советских ученых как бы сказал, что каждый человек наделен огромным запасом внутренних сил.
At one point, there was an outstanding Soviet scholar who said that every human being has a huge potential and a lot of uncovered power force in him.
Но, к сожалению, в большинстве из людей они дремлят неразбуженными.
However, in most of the cases, in most of the human beings, those inner powers stay like in the sleep mode.
И причиной тому все тот же менталитет.
And the reason to that is that very mentality.
Но иногда, и вы же понимаете, эти рельсы пересекаются.
However, на одной дороге, да?
Да.
However, sometimes those railroads, one railroad which has two paths, they crisscross each other.
И тогда возникает катастрофа.
And that leads to a fatal event, a catastrophe.
Да, то есть, когда встречаются два противоположных менталитета, возникает конфликт.
When two completely extreme and different mentalities encounter and clash each other in one human being, it generates an unbearable conflict.
И этот конфликт, он не запланированный.
And that conflict, of course, as you'd understand, is not pre-planned.
То есть человек не знает о том, что этот конфликт возник.
Person cannot even guess that he would end up having certain type of conflict within himself.
Он не может планировать эти конфликты.
There's no way they can be planned.
Потому что он не знает, какой менталитет у другого человека.
And he doesn't know if there is a clash of mentalities in the case of two human beings. He doesn't know what kind of conflict that would be because he cannot he cannot even know what type of the mentality has another
И
person.
только при встрече вот этих двух поездов выясняется, что менталитеты разные, а это неизбежно ведет к конфликту и катастрофе.
And only when these two trains crash each other, that's when people find out that the mentalities were just so different and that brought them to an accident.
Я думаю, что, возможно, мы или кто-то из наших коллег задумается о рассмотрении как бы вот категории менталитета как основной исследовательской категории для исследования как бы судьбы в рамках какой-то из социальных наук. Спасибо за внимание.
I hope that we or maybe other of our colleagues might think someday about taking mentality and considering it as a foundation key element of studying fate within one of the social sciences. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maltsev, for delivering your speech. And right away, I'm glad to give the floor to the next speaker, Professor Michael Conforti. You're welcome, sir. Please turn on your mic. Please turn on your microphone.
It's really a brilliant presentation, and that theme of the satanic determination, I love that. I've never heard it framed that way. So thank you for my colleague. In terms of the tracks and the two trains you talked about, this is something that's really part of my work because I've been thinking for years around the issue of what shapes a life. And, you know, it took me a while to understand how your group was speaking about mentality. And I asked many times, what do you mean by mentality? So I understand now from culture, from family backgrounds, economic backgrounds, geographical, which they all shape lives. And I realized these are all the factors that begin to shape the trajectory of one's life. I've been an analyst for 40 years, in clinical practice for 40 years. And I want to talk from that perspective. And also as somebody, as a human being, that you hope we can realize whatever the task is that we're meant to do in our life. It's really much more complicated than, you know, I realized when I was younger. You know, as an older man, I see that, you know, there is a path for us. And what I want to separate in the opening here is the difference between fate and destiny. And I've spoken to colleagues in Russia, and apparently there's not a separation of the words. They don't have a destiny, destinare and ufate, destination and fate. So I will ask you, as who's ever translating, we're going to speak about a difference right now between what's fate, okay, the way my colleague's speaking about it, and what's destiny. One of our colleagues made a comment many years ago when he said the difference between fate and destiny is character. Okay, the difference is character, and the way you look at fate is, imagine you're in a sailboat, and you're governed by the winds, and say you don't have a tiller to guide you, and the winds are just going to push you along. Wherever the winds and the current want to take you, you go, because you don't have any source of strength. Eventually, you learn how to catch the wind, okay? How to work with the wind, how to work with the currents, how to eventually get some kind of direction. Because in many ways, fate is really the living out of an unconscious drama that's been predicated on earlier experiences. I'll say it differently. That in many ways, when you look at it from the clinical point of view, fate is something that's either been imposed on us or we've been possessed by. And there's really not a lot of choice. Okay. So when my colleague spoke about you need some external perturbation, it's fantastic. You need it. But right now, I think what I want to look at a little bit in the beginning, and I have 10 minutes, is what is this fated issue? Okay. Fate is when the individual ability to make choices are eclipsed by something else. Okay. Whether it's the dreams of a family, the dreams of culture, and they become, without us realizing, we import them, and they become our own dreams, and we become governed by those. I was, in my own family, I come from a Southern Italian family. My father's got a 7th grade education. We worked at the New York waterfront his whole life, and I was supposed to be a truck driver. That was a dream of my family. I was going to be a truck driver. And you realize, okay, there's one piece of the mentality that affecting my particular journey. And I see with patients the same way, that there's something impacting the culture you're in, the economic situation you grew up in. However, there's always, and I like the image of the tracks, there's always these two tracks. La forza del destino più forte, no? The force of destiny is always working to counteract the inertia of fate. Okay. And I think when we look at a life, I think we need to give a lot more emphasis to the power of unconscious forces to minimize the capacity for destiny. If we look at destiny as maybe the fated aspect where we can live a better life, whatever is inborn in us, whatever the thing is that we're really meant to do with our life, be a teacher, be a translator, be a scholar, be a woodworker. And it does seem to be there are innate tendencies. And if you go back in history, for instance, Plato spoke about destiny in a beautiful way. He said, destiny comes down to us like a letter with all the words on our life written on it, our whole future. It comes down to us, and the closer it gets to us, all the letters disappear. We can't see it. Okay, it's great, right? So it's just like the Grail legend. We're never going to know, but we know there's something that we need to follow. He also said something very important about this when he interchanged two words, destiny and pattern. And you begin to learn what the destiny of your life is by the patterns that we are drawn to. And as a clinician, you're always standing in that middle position between looking at the unconscious forces that's driving that train, I'll use the image, to go on a track, and you realize it's no longer generative, but it has a life of its own. And then how do you begin to uncover whatever this other piece is that is innate, the more the inborn destiny? Okay. Let's talk about the sad part of this first, okay? The tragic aspect is that I would say the majority of people never live out the positive aspects of fate or destiny, because we're taken down by so many things, and life is difficult. And we don't find our way because we don't have that other, as my colleagues talking about, the external perturbation. We don't have that person that encourages us to remove ourselves from the other situation that's no longer generative. And how do you begin looking at your life when you're older? Especially the issue of, my colleague speaks about as a whole field of studying fate. fate in the elderly. When you look at your life at 60, 70, 80 years of age, and you ask yourself, what kind of life have you lived? What did you live a life that was the unique life that you were meant to live out? Or were you just a pawn to a drama? Were you just that sailboat just being pushed and pulled by the swells of causality, by the swells of family? And I'll make another comment quickly. I mean, if you look at culture, I mean, my own country, you know, it's rarely been admitted. We've had 2 and 3 versions of genocide in our country. It's rarely talked about. From slavery to the American Indians. You tell me what drives these forces. And as anybody who's either a sociologist, a criminologist, a psychoanalyst, you've got to ask yourself, what in God's name could drive these things to destroy people for so many years? We know it's all over the world, right? Nazi Germany was 18 million people were slaughtered. And I know many Russians lost their life in that war. I know many Russians were slaughtered. You got to ask, what are these unconscious forces? So I would add to my colleague's presentation, if we're going to study this, we have to also look at what are the unconscious forces that keep us entrained to these non-generative aspects of life, whether the cultural, the familiar, or the personal. Once those are addressed, you can then begin to come out and try to find out, you know, what is it you meant to do with your life? And I think he's 100% right that you need somebody to help articulate what is the innate pattern, the codice innato, the innate code of your life. There is a code. And some people don't believe that we have any destiny, but if you look at a life, and one of my colleagues said it, he said, if you look at the 4 events in somebody's life in the beginning of time, those 4 things you never will ever forget, those 4 memories, they may be the unfolding of the destiny of your life. So, you know, in many ways, I stand as somebody who, like I'm sure all of my colleagues, you want to be able to release whatever these spirits are that can allow us to pursue the life that we're meant to have. But I spent much of my 40-year career also looking at these unconscious dynamics that push down and inhibit. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to understand enough of what precludes our ability to move to a different kind of life. Okay, and the very last comment, very short, is one of the great Jungian analysts made a comment, and they said that intelligence is when one connects to the unconscious, because it's not a temporal form of knowledge. It's connecting to some ancient form of wisdom. So when we look back at Plato, we look back at the ancients, we look back at the sages and dreamers from antiquity, and understand how did they find a way to pave a life away from all of the things that were pushing them in a direction that were no longer generative. History's filled with this. From the Jews to every culture has had to find a way to fight against oppression. And it's also personal oppression. So thank you. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Professor Conforti, for sharing your viewpoints. And right away, I'm glad to give the floor to the next speaker, Dr. Kэрol Szumeight. You're welcome.
Thank you. Mentality and fate, what a big topic. Building on what the 2 previous speakers have said about mental traits, we all seem to agree that we have some innate characteristics. Whether they come from nurture or nature, we don't know. But they develop so early that we can't, we might as well call them innate, or we choose them so early, we might as well call them innate. But now the question is, and I think Dr. Maltsev asked this question, how, if these traits are constant, then fate rules us. How can we change? How can we manage to develop and to grow these mental attributes, or to change them if we wish? And I have some good news. to relate at first. A couple of papers were published last year, one in Current Directions in Psychological Science. This group of researchers found that there is compelling evidence that people's patterns of thinking, feeling, striving, and behaving are both consistent and malleable. So they are consistent and changeable. A second study, also published last year in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, found that even heritability is not fixed. So even the traits that we know have biological markers on them, even those can change. Now, how is it that some people are able to change and to grow and to develop beyond what fate gave them, but others are not? This was a question that Carl Jung asked 100 years ago when he was witnessing the conflict between Adler and Freud. He wondered if they were fated to disagree by temperament, and if so, are we all fated to? And he was looking at the source of these differing worldviews. And he thought that the source came from evolution, which advances diversification. So we tend to develop different skills from each other. We are innately predisposed to certain mental habits that create a particular worldview. And these differing worldviews create conflict. The problem arises when we become wedded to our worldview. We actually think that we are identified with that one perspective. And I love Dr. Maltsev's analogy of the railroad train on the railroad tracks. My own analogy was a box, much less dynamic, but I could see that our worldview can put us into a box that we become used to, or we could say it puts us on a track, a railroad track that we are used to. And because we're used to it, we actually may not realize that there are options available to us. Now, Jung wanted to create, if I use the analogy of the box, something like a periscope from a submarine so that we could peer out of our box and into other people's boxes. But actually, it turned out that wasn't good enough. That was not sufficient. It was a necessary start, but insufficient. Just seeing the diversity of worldviews is not enough to actually change one's own view and grow out of one's fixed characteristics. So Jung began to look for the constants in the psyche, and these are kind of like, he found the mental functions, and they're kind of like the mental muscles that we all share. These are not traits themselves, but they are sources of those traits within us. And he thought that they operated something like pistons in an engine. When we have one trait that we are using consciously, then its opposite will remain in the unconscious. And so we go from one trait to another, using one after another, but the polarity of the traits is what is important in Jung's system. He compared his system to a compass so that there could be any number of mental functions, any number of traits, any number of psychological types within that circumference, but the polarity is the main thing. The one in use is pointing north and its opposite will be pointing south. So Freud's worldview was pointing north and Adler's was pointing south. So Jung provided this system of psychological type as a map to mentality. And suppose, I want to use this as an example, suppose you have a colleague whom you dislike. Your colleague opposes you in everything. You say black, he says white. You say stop, he says go. He contradicts everything you say. Now, it is probable that his preferred mental function is the opposite of your preferred mental function. So yours is in the unconscious and his is conscious, and vice versa. Now, are you fated to be at odds with your colleague? Well, Jung thought that this would bring us an opportunity. This colleague shows you which functions you have suppressed within yourself. Jungian analyst Rafael López Pedraza, who was a Cuban who immigrated to Zurich, said that Jung should have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize for his book Psychological Types, which he published in 1921, which López Pedraza called the greatest treatise on tolerance ever written. Why? Because it shows us a subjective bias that almost nothing else has ever shown us, a bias against another person's mentality. And this kind of bias is more insidious than racism, sexism, nationalism, classism, or any of those other terrible prejudices. The reason it is worse than them, or more insidious rather, is because it is completely invisible. So we don't see our own subjective bias and we don't see the other person's. Now, the good thing about all of this is at midlife, our unconscious functions begin to rise. We don't have to force the issue. They're going to come up and they are going to cause us problems. And some people have a midlife crisis out of them. But if we allow this natural development to occur, these functions become more prominent in our mentality. The problem comes if we try to stuff it down. And at that point, we become solidified in our personality traits. And because it feels very uncomfortable to allow traits to come up that we are not expert in, we all want to continue doing what makes us experts. We want to practice our preferred mental function. I think in the 60s, they had this idea of consciousness raising, and it sounds good, but in fact, it seems that what we really need to do is lower our consciousness, lower the threshold of consciousness in order to access those lower functions. Though the term inferiority came up, and I really like it, we have to allow our inferiority, the places that we haven't spent our life developing and practicing. We have to allow those to come up. And Jung said those will save us, both individually and as a civilization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Šumeiت, for delivering your speech. And right away, I'm giving the floor to the next speaker, Dr. Alexander Сагайдак. You're welcome.
Здравствуйте, коллеги.
My best regards, dear colleagues.
Говоря о менталитете и судьбе, я бы все-таки хотел связать тему нашего первого вопроса с темой второго вопроса, темой веры.
So, speaking about such phenomena as mentality and fate is, first of all, Professor Сагайдак would like to connect both questions. I mean, the question we are discussing right now and the second one. And this connection could be done within the phenomena of faith.
Потому что именно рассмотрение менталитета в контексте веры дает нам понимание, как связаны менталитет и судьба.
From the perspective of Dr. Сагайдак, the understanding of mentality from the facial context helps us to comprehend what the mentality and fate is and how they are connected.
Если мы рассматриваем веру с точки зрения научных категорий, то она для нас коррелирует с чем-то, похожим на аксиологию, аподиктичность, метафизичность.
So if we are analyzing the phenomena of faith from the scientific viewpoint, first of all, we should say this phenomena correlates with axiology, apogeology, and metaphysics.
Для наших задач, пожалуй, ближе всего будет термин аксиология, как система знаний, которые признаются достоверными без эмпирического подтверждения.
Speaking from the terms of the tasks from the applicable type of task we're discussing, professor believes that actually we are, with this phenomena analysis, we're so much closer to axiology as the scientific discipline that represents the systematic knowledge of the systematic knowledge.
Если мы рассматриваем веру с ее социальной точки зрения, то опять-таки мы можем выделить три уровня. Каноническая вера, личная вера, а вот третий уровень веры, коллективная или массовая, это как раз и есть что-то близкое менталитету.
Again, analyzing faith from the sociological viewpoint, we could pretend that it consists of three layers. So the first layer is the canonical one, the second layer is the personal layer, whilst the third layer is the layer of collective understanding or the massive understanding. And this very third level of collective understanding is that very thing that so brings us and pushes us closer to the mentality phenomena comprehension.
Каноническая вера – это та система знания, которая разрабатывается богословами и священнослужителями.
Speaking about the canonical type of faith, the canonics actually comes from the set of knowledge that's been summarized by theologists.
Личная вера – это результат индивидуальных духовных поисков человека.
Personal faith is the result of the personal thrives and quest of looking for answers for the questions of the individual himself.
А вот менталитет мы могли бы обозначить как коллективную веру в ее исторической развертке.
And speaking about mentality, the third issue, we could represent the mentality as the collective faith. I mean, the collective faith in synthetics with the historical viewpoint.
Из всего того, что мы знаем сегодня о менталитете, мы можем с уверенностью говорить, что, пожалуй, именно к юнгианской психологии этот феномен и относится ближе всего.
And again, analyzing from the systematic scientific perspective the mentality issue, we should say that the Jungian or set of knowledge is that very set that is so much closer to understanding the mentality.
Потому что рассмотрение архетипа как духовного инстинкта, как об этом говорил наш мэтр Карл Густав Юнг.
Why is it so? Why is Dr. Sagaidak so sure? Because actually the archetype is being defined and described as this spiritual instinct, as Carl Gustav Jung would say.
Дает нам великолепное понимание того, что такое менталитет как движущая сила коллективной судьбы.
And this very aspect of the spiritual thrive actually helps us to realize the mentality as the pushing force of the collective fate.
Менталитет, будучи дорациональным уровнем знания коллективного,
Moreover, Professor Sagaidak described the mentality as the pre-rational phenomena. It's like the result of pre-rational synthesis.
Так вот, в самом основании своем менталитет всегда связан с некой сверхценной идеей, исторической миссией или даже, можно сказать, неким мессианским представлением данного народа о себе.
Moreover, in the very core, or in the very basement of mentality, we should say that this phenomena is connected with the hyper idea. I mean, the total or utmost voluble idea of the mass, maybe even the idea that is connected with the historical mission of a certain group of people.
А мы знаем, что историческая миссия, а уж тем более мессианские представления, это всегда коллективный миф.
And sure enough, speaking about historical mission and the representation of people about their mission, this is also connected with the collective or Jungian representation.
Юнг очень подробно и очень результативно в свое время исследовал влияние коллективных мифов на немецкий менталитет.
So the core component of this synthetics is all about mythology. And Carl Gustav Jung would research the connection of mentality and this collective mythology type profoundly, thoroughly.
Мы знаем, что когда был молодым человеком еще дед Юнга, Карл Густав Юнг старший,
and right now we're going to speak about the period of time when the grandfather of Carl Gustav Jung, he was a young man. Not the Carl Gustav Jung, the scholar we know, but his grandpa.
Как раз тогда набирало свою силу в Германии движение Völkisch, и одной из сверхценных идей этого движения был знаменитый миф о Зигфриде и Регине.
And then, speaking about the times of grandfather of Carl Gustav Jung, we should say that back those days in Germany, a very interesting movement erased. It was the movement, the Völkisch movement, or the massive movement of people. And this Völkisch movement in its core had the utmostly voluble idea that is the mythology of Siegfried and Rein.
Мы знаем в ретроспективе двух минувших столетий, какое влияние оказало движение Völkisch и конкретно миф о Зигфриде и Регине на менталитет немецкого народа.
And as a matter of fact, analyzing the 19th and 20th centuries of human history, we know actually the result of this myth influence. I mean, the myth of Regan and Siegfried, how it influenced German people, and not only Germans.
Возьмем пример из совершенно другого континента, другого народа и другой культуры.
And now we're going to switch to quite different culture. We're going to speak about different continent and the other peoples.
В такой стране, как Эфиопия, существует миф о том, что легендарный царь Соломон и легендарная царица Савская состояли в браке, и у них родился ребенок.
In such country that is the Ethiopia, actually there was an ancient myth about the king Solomon and the queen Savskaya, who actually were they were the family and they had a son.
И этот брак и ребенок, который родился в этом браке, он символизировал собой союз, с одной стороны, религиозного знания, а с другой стороны, знания эзотерического.
And this very marriage of this king and queen, it actually represented and it symbolized the union of religious knowledge and so-called the sacred knowledge or esoteric knowledge.
И вот согласно этому мифу потомки Соломона и царицы Савской, которые стали императорами Эфиопии, они несли в менталитете своего народа вот это стремление к соединению веры и магии.
And as a matter of fact, we should say that the descendants of the king of Solomon and this Savskaya queen, we should say that the descendants, furthermore, they transferred the myth of unification of faith and magic.
И действительно, в менталитете эфиопского народа мы наблюдаем удивительно гармоничное сочетание, с одной стороны, христианской религиозной догматики, с другой стороны, традиционных африканских магических верований.
And as a matter of fact, today, analyzing the Ethiopical type of mentality, we should say that this mentality magically intersects and actually engages both Christian dogmatic religious perception of the world as well as African magical ritualic perception.
Из всего этого мы можем сделать вывод, что менталитет как дологический, дорациональный уровень знания представляет собой действительно аксиологию данного народа.
And overall, to sum up, in order to come to the conclusion, we can say that the mentality as the pre-logical and pre-rational phenomena represents the axiology of the ethnics, the axiology of the peoples.
А коллективная вера – это один из самых мощных факторов влияния как на коллективную, так и на индивидуальную судьбу.
And moreover, this collective type of faith is that one significant and powerful factor of influence that not only influences the individual, but also the fate of the peoples, of the nation.
Современные процессы конвергенции народов и наций сделали эту коллективную веру, веру менталитета, более диффузной, но от этого она никуда не делась. Она по-прежнему продолжает действовать.
And we should say that contemporary convergence tendency that we witness that actually made and transformed this collective type of faith a little bit diffused. However, being diffused, it didn't disappear. It still exists.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you so much for your kind attention, dear colleagues. Thank you so much, Dr. Sagaidak, for your speech. And this is the time we're switching to the second question of our discussion. I mean, the faith as the direction of one's aspirations. And right away, I'm giving the floor to our speaker, Dr. Oleg Maltsev. You're welcome.
Спасибо за то, что дали слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
Я думал, как подойти к этому вопросу.
I spent some time thinking about how should I approach this question.
Потому что этот вопрос является ключом к менталитету.
Because the answer to this question would give us a key to the mentality.
И огромное спасибо Александру Николаевичу за содержательный доклад.
Thank you, Professor Sagaidak, for such a speech.
Да, я его продолжу просто.
I will continue that speech.
Да. Так вот, меня вере учили в одном прекрасном месте Земли.
So I was taught what is faith in a very special place on this earth.
Так как вера вне категории у нас академической науки,
Because faith is out of the category, out of the academic science.
да, то есть мне пришлось учиться вере в одном прекрасном месте.
I had to learn what is faith in an amazing spot on this earth.
И поверьте, там в этом прекрасном месте очень академично объясняют, что такое вера и что такое устремление человека.
And please believe me, in that particular place that I will mention in a bit, they very academically explain you what is faith and what is aspiration.
Я уже говорил на одной из панелей, я туда всех психологов на стажировку отправил.
I have already mentioned in one of the panels that I would, if it was my will, I would have sent all the psychologists from around the world to do their internship on that territory.
На вот этой территории существует такая длинная палка.
On this territory, they have a very long stick.
Южные итальянцы говорят бастона, испанцы говорят гаротта.
Southern Italians call that stick bastone, and Spanish people call that garotta.
Да. Так вот, там с первого дня объясняют, что ничто так не прочищает голову человека, как удар этой большой палкой по голове.
And over there, they explain that there is no remedy in this world that would compare to getting hit by one bastone once. I mean, your mind becomes super clear.
Да, и это прямо с молоком матери впитывается.
And that knowledge, I mean, one is absorbed by that knowledge, just like with the milk of his mother.
Так вот, так как южные итальянцы очень любят упражняться с этой палкой.
And because Southern Italians are keen and very good in exercising with the stick.
У них разные палки там есть. Ну вот, а с этой большой, длинной они особенно любят упражняться.
And in the tradition, the martial tradition in the Southern Italy, they have different sticks, but this long one is of a special favorite of them.
Она там возведена в ранг философской категории.
And we can say that it is raised to the rank of a philosophical category.
Да, именно эта палка в руках святого Рока во всех храмах стоит.
And this stick is being held by the Saint Rock in almost every temple on the territory of southern Italy.
Так вот, эта палка характеризует веру человека как бы и его связь с устремлениями.
And this stick symbolizes the faith of a human being and the connection with his aspirations.
Потому что вера – это палка о двух концах.
Because when we speak about faith itself, it's like a stick which has two extremes.
Когда я слышу от человека «мне хотелось бы верить», я понимаю, что эта палка скоро ударит его по голове.
When I hear one sentence from a person that he says, I would have wanted to believe, I want to believe that something is like this, I understand that very soon the other side of the stick is going to land on his head.
И эта палка как раз будет в руках вот этого самого святого Рока.
And that stick, while landing on one's hand, would be in the hands of that Saint Rock.
Вот такими красочными как бы образами описывается учение о вере.
And these were those vivid descriptions that were given to me when the faith was being described.
А в чем же секрет?
And what is the secret?
А дело в том, что вера – это палка о двух концах.
The faith, again, is a stick with two extremes.
Один конец палки у кого-то в руках,
One extreme of the stick is in somebody's hand,
а другой конец палки бьет почему-то.
and the other extreme of the stick lands on something.
Они там, когда тренируются, они ставят глиняные горшки, разбивают горшки этой палкой.
Because during the training in southern Italy, they use this pots made from clay, and they smash those pots.
И каждый раз, когда разлетается горшок, у человека возникает понимание, что действительно вера – это палка о двух концах.
And when the clay pot is smashed to pieces, a person understands from a very young age that a faith is always about the stick with two extremes.
Потому что вера бывает двух типов.
Because there are two types of faith.
То есть вера, которая основана на желании знать, что будет дальше.
There is a faith which is based on a innate desire to know what is going to happen next.
И вера, основанная на знании.
And another type of faith is the one which is based on knowledge. Basically, you believe in something because you know that it is so.
То есть, когда знание порождает веру,
When knowledge generates and originates the faith,
тогда палка у вас в руках.
then you are the one who is holding the stick.
Если же вера порождает знание,
In the case when the faith or belief generates the knowledge,
тогда палка в руках у кого-то другого.
then the stick is in the hands of somebody else.
Нельзя верить в то, что ты не знаешь.
One is not supposed to believe in things that he or she doesn't know.
И поэтому одни люди как бы устремляются вперед и добиваются многого в жизни, потому что их вера основана на знании.
And to give a real life example, this is the reason why some people aspire and do achieve incredible things in their lives, is because their belief, their faith is founded on the knowledge.
А другие из раза в раз получают этой большой палкой по голове, потому что их знания основаны на вере.
In contrast, there are other category of people that always get hit by the stick. It's because their knowledge is based on faith.
Да, и как говорили мои коллеги на юге Италии, храни Бог юг Италии, Сицилию, Калабрию, компанию. Да? Спасибо за внимание.
And as my colleagues in southern Italy would say, God save the southern Italy, Sicily, Calabria, and Campania. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maltzer, for delivering your speech. Now I'm pleased to give the floor to our next speaker and expert, Professor Michael Conforti. You're welcome, sir. And please turn on your microphone.
And it's great to be back in Southern Italy, where my family's from. So thank you for that part of the presentation. We're from Sicily, Calabria, and Naples, my family. I want to open this, and I try to do it systematically and within the time limit. To begin with the theme of amor fati, to love one's fate. You know, we're taught to love our fate, to whatever it is we're meant to do with our life. From the perspective of many years of clinical work, at some point you have to say, why? Why love the fate if the fate is such a dark fate? Because many people, unless there is a perturbation that my colleague is speaking about, some external source that comes to change it, it becomes almost predictable that that fate will become limited and confined by the antecedent events in one's life. This is one of the saddest parts of clinical work, I'll tell you that right now, clinical and life, that whatever the journey has been up to this point, unless something comes to shift it dramatically, it's going to continue. And I heard one analyst say to somebody, he said, look, one of the most distinguished analysts was from Israel that we had. He said to the patient, you have a terrible fate. This is very strange to hear, right? To say to a patient, you have a terrible fate. He said, we're going to try to change your fate. And I heard this, say, oh my God, this is totally arrogant. And I realized when I thought about it, it wasn't arrogant, because what he was looking to do was to try to find a way to shift the trajectory, to shift the fields. Because if you're in one field, say a field of severe limitation, a field of total constraint, there are ways to begin to make the shift. So that's number one, that it's a question of, do you really amor fati? The next piece is in terms of a curriculum that my colleague's speaking about. Something I've been involved in 30 years in studying the theme of what shapes a life is I found the following 4 disciplines are necessary to really help with this. Because what we're looking at is when you talk about fate, destiny, shifting it, making it more generative or whatever, we're talking about a transformation of energy. Okay, if you want to take it down into energetic terms, it's transformation of energy. The 4 fields I speak about this in a really profound way are systems theory, perturbation theory, chaos theory, and nonlinear dynamics. Okay, what they're all speaking about is when you begin to see energy that becomes stagnant and regressive, and what is it in systems that create complexity. Okay, it's essential to understand this, because when you're looking at something and you realize, well, this is not a great fate, this is not a great story, there's something that becomes regressive and stale about the system. When you study dynamical systems, which I've done now for 30 years, you realize there are ways to both assess the presence of stagnation and ways to generate the movement towards complexity. Okay, so this is a huge piece in this. The next thing is the issue of, you mentioned faith and belief, my Jungian colleague spoke about. When Jung was asked toward the end of his life, do you believe in God? He was an old man, he stammered, he kind of stuttered, and he couldn't answer right away. He was old. And he finally said, no, I don't believe in God. I said, oh my God, you're Jung, you don't believe in God. He said, I know, because belief is speculative. Faith is speculative. He said, faith is there in the absence of confirmed experiences. And he wasn't big on faith. And in many ways, I don't think faith is enough to help us with the issue, the brilliant issue you've raised for this committee today, okay? In terms of how do we, so you're asking, how do we strengthen the generative alignment? And I want to give one example that is one of the most powerful that ever happened in my career about looking at how a wonderful destiny could be accomplished and those factors that could stop it, okay? It's all in one short dream. It's a dream of a man who was 72 years old and retired, a university professor, a brilliant man. And it was a sense of excitement about life. It was infectious. You around him, you just wanted to keep on learning more. He was a good person. And he wanted to give it all up to become a carpenter at 72 years of age. Okay. Anyway, he had this dream. He dreamt of there was wood underwater for like 50 to 60 years. But the wood was prepared. It was what do you call it? Legale, tied. It was tied up on both sides. So somebody intentionally put that wood underwater and was there in a dream for 50, 60, 70 years. What he said was, I want to get the wood up to the land, and I want, if it's any good, I'm going to burn it. Put it in my wood stove and heat it, like in a fireplace, whatever. A long story short, I asked him, do you know anything about wood that's stored underwater? Objectively. See, this is the objective psyche that my Jungian colleagues would know a lot about. In the outer natural world, do we know anything about wood that's stored like this? And the answer is, we know a lot. It's one of the ways the Vikings created those magnificent sailing ships. How many centuries ago? They kept the wood underwater to cure it. The curare pezzo di legno, to cure the piece of wood, okay? It cured it, it made it stronger. You could even make the bends in it. It was the only way to do the wood. Also, they found out, you know how they did the wood for the Stradivarius violins, the most beautiful violins in history? The wood was cured underwater. This dream is a profound dream saying this man discovered something that's been curing for many years. However, now here's a piece, the two tracks that my colleague spoke about, and I love the image. The track of regression, the track of complexity. If you find wood that is that valuable, that you can use it for a Stradivarius violin, it's invaluable. It's worth thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars, symbolically and psychically and literally. Do you want to put that in your fireplace? No. The dream was saying he has a tendency to take something of immeasurable value and misuse it. You don't do that. Whereas if you use that wood for something really sacred, whatever words you want to use, sacred, valuable, profitable in his own life, it's a movement towards a destiny that's generative. I'll never forget this dream because, number one, the dreamer knew nothing about this experience. So it came clearly from the collective unconscious. It's part of history. And again, people that know history in wood and shipbuilding and how to do the master carpenters will know about wood underwater. It's an objective fact of life. The dream was saying also the two tracks. The regressive track was to misuse that gift. Put it in your fireplace and burn it. Not something that valuable. You don't misuse a gift like this. Now, faith and belief. I think it's got to be augmented with a discipline. Okay, a discipline of knowing about psychic energy, knowing about regressive forces of energy, and moving towards complexity. With that, it takes, I think, a really innate understanding and a skill and a discipline of learning about imagery. To not know about the wood underwater, we would have never understood this dream for this man. We would never understood that there was a chance to live out a destiny, not in a regressive way, not to be a carpenter the rest of your life. That's not what he needed. And what I said to him was, why don't you go back and teach a little bit, like one course at a college? His life opened up again. From 5 students the first week to 20 students to 200 students the next week, they knew they had a gifted teacher. His life, his soul, the vitality came back. He was back on the road to living out whatever his destiny was. We have no idea what it was, but we knew the movement towards regression had been stopped. The energy that was moving backwards was stopped because of the understanding of the image. This is why I would say faith and belief, wonderful. I want to have faith as much as anybody. I want to believe a better life. It also takes a tremendous skill and expertise. If you talk about the two tracks, somebody needs to know how to switch track. It's a lot of precision, a lot of skill as a conductor, as the people that work the tracks, to know when to change it, how to signal. You need to turn right or to turn left. Somebody needs that information. There is an expertise that comes to working with symbols where we can begin to see the regressive, replicative, iterative nature of fate, keeping you stuck like that sailboat stuck in the water because it can't go anywhere, or the generative aspect of a destiny, which is moving forward. The last piece of this is when you say destiny, you think of destinari. My colleague knows the Italian. Destinari. Destinari, it doesn't mean one thing. Destinari is an orientation. It's an orientation for you. It may be an orientation towards scholarship and translation of words, of language. For somebody else, it may be obviously a tremendous fascination with fate. It becomes a totem of your life. When one can begin to understand what the ontological core of this issue is, you begin to then consciously engage with what may be the fated aspect. But again, I'm saying it's an expertise, like any field. The conductors on the train, it's expertise. As a linguist, it's expertise. Learning the Southern Italian temperament. He'll learn how to help him about the Southern Italian temperament. It's very specific, because when you realize each field, each area of life has its own prefigured dynamics, it takes a lot of knowledge. And that's why faith and belief are wonderful, but we add to that third part, the discipline of understanding imagery and symbolism to help the shift. And that's why this dream, I will never forget, it happened 30 years ago with a patient, but it really showed you where the energy, there's this beautiful piece of gold, beautiful piece of wood, could be misused, put it in a damn fireplace, or maybe cook a pizza with it. Cook a pizza with a cheap piece of wood. You don't need this piece of gold. I cook with wood. For 40 years, I heat my house with wood, okay? I cook with wood. You don't use that kind of wood for that. Or can you really understand, say, oh my God, I see the tendency, I see the iteration of misusing the gift. You could stop it then and be conscious. And that's the outside perturbation that my colleague's speaking about to make the shift. So with that, I will stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Conforti, for sharing your ideas, for delivering your speech. And now I'm giving the floor to Dr. Kэрol Szumeight. You're welcome. Please turn on your mic.
Thank you. I want to start to answer this question by giving you an example from my own life when I was in grad school, and I needed someone like Dr. Conforti to help me through this conundrum. I learned out of this incident that aspiration without faith can be destructive. I did everything. I had no faith in myself or my professors or life. I thought, I just have to work really hard. The key word is drive. I drove myself. And the harder I drove myself, the less I succeeded. And at a certain point, I actually had a catastrophe, which is I lost all of my thesis research. This was in the days before computers, so it was in physical format. How could that just disappear? That told me right there that I have an unconscious. And my unconscious had sabotaged me to save me. It took me a while to figure out how it saved me. But eventually I reconstituted my thesis, and I wrote it around the principle that I discovered there, which I called the perversity principle, namely, the degree of success achieved is inversely proportional to the degree of effort expended. Now, this, I didn't know if this was true for everyone or just for me or under which circumstances, but I wrote my thesis about that. And some years later, I discovered that Jung talked about this principle, and he used the word that the Greeks came up with. They have a word for everything. Their word is enantiodromia. You don't have to remember that. It basically means, it's from Heraclitus, taking anything to an extreme causes it to reverse itself and become its opposite. I want to use as an example the American election of 2016, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. How is it that the most prepared candidate, the most prepared presidential candidate in American history, lost to the least prepared presidential candidate in American history, which is Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump 2-1. She made many more allies. She wrote many more policy statements. She worked much harder. Trump wasn't trying very hard. He didn't even really expect to win. He was kind of rehearsing his concession speech right up to the end, but Hillary believed that she would win. And so it was a huge setback. Well, I think this has something to do with the perversity principle. Hillary Clinton's favorite quotation is from Benjamin Franklin: by failing to prepare, you prepare to fail. Preparation is everything for Hillary Clinton. She made a huge career and a huge success of her life based on this quality of always preparing and perhaps over preparing. And I think that's what I do too. I think I over prepare. You know, Anna Filipova sent me an email today asking me for my notes for my speech. And then she sent another email right away and said, if you don't have any notes, don't worry. And I had to laugh because I've never participated in a panel or any presentation without extensive notes. That is my issue that I'm still trying to understand and to overcome. And Jung had a kind of explanation for it. Of course, I understand Hillary Clinton lost for a whole variety of reasons, maybe sexism, maybe populism, all those other things. But I just used her as an example. And then in 2020, Donald Trump did the same thing. He overdetermined the outcome of the election. He tried every trick to ensure that he would win. He was driven. And what was the result? He got a very counter-intentional result. He hurt his reputation. He hurt his brand, the Trump brand, which was the only thing he really cared about. Now, for Clinton, she didn't want to give up this quality of preparation, which had made her a huge success. But in fact, she needed to. She was criticized, perhaps unfairly, for not being spontaneous enough. Now, you can't be super prepared and rehearsed and also spontaneous, or maybe you can, but she wasn't able to combine those two opposing qualities. So for me, I have learned that aspiration has the seeds of its own destruction. And I'm trying to understand when it is that happens. I was surprised to learn that this principle has been corroborated by experimental psychology and even by neuroscience. And the psychologist who verified it in his laboratory is Daniel Wegner of MIT. In the 1990s, he did a series of experiments that showed this principle whereby when people work very, very hard, they cause this counter-intentional result. He called it ironic process theory. And I'm going to read what he said about it. Attempts to influence mental states require monitoring processes that act subtly yet consistently in a direction precisely opposite the intended control. Now I'll read to you what Jung said about it. This characteristic phenomenon, and he meant enantiodromia, practically always occurs when an extreme one-sided tendency dominates conscious life. Think Hillary Clinton, over preparation. In time, an equally powerful counterposition is built up, and the unconscious breaks through conscious control because the unconscious compensates for every conscious intention. This maintains a balance in our mentality. Now, Wegner was a little bit extreme in his idea. The name of his book is The Illusion of Conscious Will, but he credited a very interesting neuroscientist, a Ukrainian immigrant named, or rather the son of a Ukrainian immigrant. His name was Benjamin Libet, L-I-B-E-T. His mother was from Kiev and his father from Brusilov. And Libet did this series of experiments that Daniel Wegner then took up. And Libet, unlike Wegner, regarded his experimental results to be entirely compatible with free will. So I think Wegner was a little bit extreme. And if I understand this principle and Jung himself, I think it is about avoiding the extremes, because when we go into excess, we can cause this terrible reversal. Now, what is the solution to it? Jung found the solution in an Asian concept called Wu Wei, W-U-W-E-I, which you can translate as effortless action. An Asian scholar has a book out on this called Trying Not to Try. Now you can see the paradox. It's a very hard concept to allow, but I would translate it for this purposes of this conference as aspiration without coercion. Aspiration without trying to control the outcomes. So you do your best, but you don't control the outcome. So it's aspiration tempered by faith. If we have enough faith to surrender control, then we can perhaps realize some of our aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kэрol Шумейт, for delivering your speech. And this is the time I'm giving the floor to the next speaker, Dr. Alexandr Сагайдак. You're welcome.
Продолжая тему взаимосвязи менталитета и веры, мы должны отметить, что вера важна для нас прежде всего как мотивирующий фактор.
So we are going to prolong our speech. I mean, Dr. Sagaidak is going to continue his speech regarding the interconnection of mentality and faith phenomena. And we should say that faith as some sort of phenomena is a very significant motivational type of force.
Мы знаем, что мотивация веры наиболее сильная, глубокая и безусловная, не знающая сомнений.
As a matter of fact, the motivation of faith is one of the most deep one, unconscious one, and let me say, irrational one.
И если мы рассматриваем вот эти три уровня веры, каноническая, личная и коллективная, то коллективная вера, менталитет, оказывается наиболее масштабной социальной мотивирующей силой.
So again, speaking about three layers of faith, I mean the connotative, the personal, and the collective one. The collective type of faith or the mass faith is one of the most, let me say, scaled one, is one of the most outstanding, the most covering.
Каноническая вера, согласно исследованиям, это удел примерно 5% населения.
Regarding certain research results, according to statistics, we should say that the canonic type of faith, or the layer number one, it's all about only 5% of the Earth population, not more.
Богословы, священнослужители, духовные подвижники – это люди с очень высокой мотивацией, но их всего 5%.
And of course, speaking about theologists, people of religious studies, priests, and those who are, let me say, living this canonic type of faith, of course, they are highly motivated. However, there is just a small, let me say, percentage of these people existing and living today.
Личная вера – явление куда более масштабное, но она обладает гораздо более слабой и, самое главное, неустойчивой мотивацией.
Of course, speaking about the personal faith, this phenomenon is much more scaled. I mean, it's not like 5%. Almost all people believe in something and have faith in something. However, this very statistics actually shows the other tendency, that this type of faith is one of the most unstable.
Менталитет как коллективная вера соединяет в себе и силу мотивации, и ее социальный масштаб.
So if we're speaking about the mentality as the type of collective faith, this mentality unites in itself both the scale and this motivational type of force.
Из социальной психологии мы знаем, что групповая вера – это самый сильный вид групповой динамики и одновременно самый сильный вид группового давления.
So speaking in the terms of social psychology, we should say that the collective type of faith or the group faith is one of the most significant and striking type of dynamics.
Но менталитет – это спонтанно формирующаяся вера и спонтанно формирующаяся мотивация.
However, Dr. Sagaidak suggests that mentality is the spontaneous type of faith shaping, as well as the spontaneous type of shaping the beliefs of the person.
На динамику менталитета влияет огромное количество факторов, многие из которых нам еще, в общем-то, и неизвестны.
And speaking about that very dynamics of mentality shaping, there are so many factors that influence and counter-influence this process of shaping. And the most emphatic idea is about, we don't know these factors and factors. We don't know this exhaustive list of them.
Например, мы, юнгианцы, знаем, что на динамику менталитета решающее влияние оказывает архетипическая динамика, но от чего, в свою очередь, зависит архетипическая динамика, это мы пока еще знаем мало.
So, as a matter of fact, being a Jungian psychologist, Professor Sagaidak says that Jungians actually know that the dynamics of mentality shaping depends upon the archetype, the archetype dynamics. However, what are the factors that are motivating the archetype dynamics? We don't know that list.
В этом плане меня очень впечатлила фраза самого Юнга, которой он описывал события, которые наблюдал в своей жизни.
Moreover, Dr. Sagaidak was impressed by a certain saying of Carl Gustav Jung, by which he depicted certain events he was witnessing. I'm going to speak about that phrase furthermore.
Фраза звучит примерно так. Лига наций рассуждала о всеобщем разоружении, а одноглазый охотник уже смеялся и седлал Слейпнера.
Well, let me say in brief, the League of Nations was speculating about the total disarmament. However, whilst one group of people was speculating, the other were taking horses to fight.
Этой фразой Юнг великолепно передал атмосферу того времени.
Actually, this phrase, this rephrasing of Jung's speculation, it actually catches the fire of the atmosphere of that epoch.
Этой фразой он передал, насколько коллективная вера германского народа хотела войны.
And this phrase of Jung actually expresses how much Germans actually were thriving to fight. They were thriving to start the war.
И
Not to start the war, sorry, just they were striving for the war as for the phenomena.
И никакие усилия правительств западных стран не смогли эту войну остановить.
And actually, this pushes us to the conclusion that there is no effort of any other neighborhood were capable to stop or prevent the war.
Разворачивание какой веры мы наблюдаем сейчас?
And speaking about the faith development these days, currently, what are we witnessing?
Мы наблюдаем разворачивание коллективной веры в божество по имени Чума.
Right now, we are witnessing the development of collective faith or the mass faith towards such a deity or towards such a God that is a plague.
Фрау Хольда, как называли ее древние германцы.
Frau Holde, this is the way ancient Germans would call that deity.
Мы знаем, что в коллективном бессознательном европейских народов архетипические сценарии чумы имеют очень серьезное представительство.
And as a matter of fact, we do know these days that regarding the European mentality minds, the archetypal scripts or scenarios regarding plague are, let me say, significantly important to us.
И мы с вами наблюдаем, как научное знание по имени медицина постепенно проигрывает схватку фаталистической вере под названием «карающая чума».
And actually, these days, Professor Sagaidak suggests, we are witnessing the way medicine as a discipline of knowledge, as the bunch of knowledgeable discipline, it loses the battle and loses the fight to this mythological perception of plague that actually took its sword and actually punishes the people with the sword.
И мы можем быть уверены, что медицина эту схватку проиграет.
And Professor Sagaidak is sure that actually medicine is going to lose this very battle.
Потому что архетипический сценарий чумы из всех видов веры усиливает фаталистическую.
And this is also due to the fact that archetype scenario or script of plague is actually being, let me say, accelerated by the fatal consequences.
Под влиянием архетипического сценария чумы усиливается именно коллективный фатализм во всех видах менталитета.
By this, Professor Sagaidak concludes that actually the collective fatalism perception is getting more and more obvious under this archetypal plague scenario.
Поэтому нам сейчас как раз очень актуально будет вспомнить, что такое фаталистическая вера и как она представлена в менталитетах разных народов.
So actually, these are the days that for us it is relevant to refer to the notion of fatalistic faith and the way this fatalistic faith is represented in different European mentalities.
Потому что именно такие закономерности массового поведения мы уже наблюдаем, и они будут еще более усиливаться.
And actually, this is the causal and consequence connection, I mean, this ratio that helps us to see the way this mythology actually is being reflected in real life events.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you so much, dear colleagues, for your kind attention. Thank you so much, Dr. Sagaidak, for sharing your viewpoints. So this is the moment, I should say, this is a closing moment by which I am thankful to all the speakers, our colleagues, experts, especially to the speakers of this online session panel. I mean, Dr. Oleg Maltsev, I mean, Professor Michael Conforti, I mean, Dr. Kэрol Shumeyt, and Dr. Alexandr Sagaidak. So this is the high time. We have finished our final online session panel of the International Interdisciplinary Conference, The Role of Mentality in Human Life and Culture, arranged by the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Soon after, the conference issues such as text papers, video reports, online discussion panels will be published on the conference website later on. Furthermore, a conference resolution will be published as well, available to those who are interested. And by this, once again, thank you so much for your kind attention, for your participation, for your impact, and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Счастливо.